Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar today on the economic consequences of the coronavirus pandemic. Welcome to all our guests, especially those who have joined us on YouTube. We've exceeded our expectation. There's over 5,500 signups today, so we have some on YouTube as well. So welcome to the session. I'm Chris Howells, the Director of Media Relations and Research Communications at INSEAD. Now I'd like to introduce you to Antonio Fatas. He is a Professor of Economics at INSEAD. He's also the Portuguese Council Chair Professor of European Studies at INSEAD. He has a PhD in economics from Harvard University. He'd like to get started as soon as possible because we have so many questions and many of you signed up and waiting to hear him. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over now to you, Antonio, to begin.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone attending this webinar. I know these are difficult times for everyone and I hope everyone is safe. In my presentation, before I start putting up some of the slides, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. First, things are moving very fast. So it is very difficult for anyone at this point to have clarity on what is about to happen or what will happen over the coming months or even years. So a lot of what I'll say will be based on what we know today. It will change over time. If anyone is interested in knowing more about the economic consequences of COVID and how it evolves over time, I'm trying to do a couple of things myself to keep people updated. One is on my blog, I'm putting these daily links to articles, opinions on facts of what is happening and what might happen in the future. And then through Twitter, I post as well some of these readings and some of these opinions that I find interesting. So everyone after the webinar wants to keep this conversation ongoing, please use any of those means available. Now, let me just highlight how I want to present where we are and where we might go in the future. I want to talk about three different things. I'm going to put my thoughts into three blocks. First, I'm going to start talking about what I call the health shock. This is obviously a pandemic. This is not a financial shock. And the consequences and the likely path that the economy will follow will depend very much on how the pandemic evolves. Now, I'm not an expert on that, but I'll do my best to highlight how what the experts say connects to what economists like myself think about the economy. The second thing that I'll do is I'll talk about the economics. So I'll talk about the economic consequences of what we're seeing, and I'll talk about the policies that we're implementing. In particular, I'll talk about the central bank, monetary policy, government's fiscal policy. And then towards the end, I'll try to look forward and I'll try as much as I can to take an optimistic view and try to ask the question, how do we get out of the situation in which we're in? Is there an easy path? What are the hurdles? And what are the type of policies that will help us get out of where we are? Now, after each of these blocks, I'll take a pause and Chris and I will have a conversation, bring in some of the questions that some of you have submitted in advance or some of the questions that we see in the Q&A at the bottom of Zoom. Now, let me start with the first aspect of the crisis, which is what originated the crisis, which is the health shock. Now, by now, I think most of us know a lot more about pandemics and epidemiology than we ever wanted to know. We've read a lot about it. And of course, for those of us who are not experts, it's hard to understand. I want to start with a light note. I don't know if any of you have seen this chart on the internet that looks at the time we all spending looking at these exponential graphs. And by now, that time itself looks exponential. So we've all been really reading as much as we can about the disease, the spread. Now, what is it that we know and how it relates to economic outcomes? Well, what we know is that this type of pandemics or any type of spread of a virus or anything else tends to have a shape which looks like a curve. Now, I'm going to show you something which is not from the current pandemic, which is the historical data on the regular flu and how it spreads in two countries, in the US and Canada. And hopefully you all can see a nice shape, which is the curve that accelerates at some point. There's an increasing number of cases coming up over time. You reach a peak and then you go down. Now, this is fairly standard and fairly well known. And this is what we're likely to see. We're seeing already in the current pandemic. Now, what is the concern when you look at this picture? I mean, we've seen it before. We obviously experience it every year with the regular flu. Now, this is not the regular flu. We're worried about two elements. Element number one, we're worried about the fatalities and in some cases, long-term consequences of people who get sick. And then we're worried about something else, which is a side effect, which is if the curve goes up very fast, it will collapse the health system. We will reach our limit in terms of beds, intensive care units, etc., etc. The fatalities will be much higher. And in addition, other people who have any other medical need might not be able to be attended the way they should. Now, that's the question that has led to what probably most of you have heard, the strategy of flattening the curve, trying to do our best to have a curve that doesn't go up very fast, that doesn't reach a very high peak, and therefore overwhelms less the healthcare system. So let me show you a picture that most of you probably have seen by now. This is sort of like two scenarios. The red one is if we don't do anything. So we're gonna have a curve that is gonna go up really fast at the beginning of the episode, and it's gonna reach a peak that is it's gonna be overwhelming for our healthcare facilities. So the sort of horizontal line here that says healthcare system capacity. If we go over that level, it means that at some point we're gonna hit our limits. And of course, we're gonna see more fatalities, more of a chaotic environment in the healthcare system, and consequences on the economy and everything else. So the goal today is to make that red line look more like the gray one, to find a way to spread the virus less at a speed which is lower, and we don't reach the same number of people infected in such a short period of time. Now, I think this is obviously an approach that I think any country that I can think of follows today, and this is the approach that scientists will advise. Now, despite the agreement, there's a million unknowns. And here is where, even if you ask experts, they have sort of like forecasts of what that curve will look like that look very different. I'm highlighting here some of the unknowns. I'll highlight a few more in a second, but it's a question of how easy it is to get infected, what the scientists call R0. So like how many people an infected person infects. And depending on that number, the crisis is gonna spread very fast or not. Then there's a question of how our daily interactions change that spread. What if we don't get close to each other? What if we wear masks? What if we don't go to work at the same time? Can we reduce the spread? And then there's fundamental questions about how many people end up sick enough to end up in a hospital, in an ICU. And at the end of the day, of course, one of the biggest losses is in terms of fatalities, how many people might die out of this disease. Now, what do we know? We have some facts, but we have a set of facts which are incomplete. We all understand that our healthcare infrastructure is limited. That's the first fact. This is a chart that looks at the number of critical care beds per 100,000% of the population. On average, I'm choosing Europe as an example, but we could look at other countries as well. On average, the number is around 12 beds per 100,000 people, with a lot of variations. A country like Germany, which is close to 30, a country like Portugal, which is close to 4. So we understand these limits, and we understand that it's very difficult to change these limits fast. We also can look at the data. We all have been looking at these pictures. I'll borrow a few from the Financial Times that does a very good job of summarizing the situation. This is the number of sort of like infections over time in different countries. And you can see shapes that starts looking like that curve that I showed earlier. But of course, there's a lot of noise in this picture. Not every country is doing the same number of tests. Not every country has followed the same measures of containment. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. So we're still not sure what would be the path that we follow under several scenarios. And then we have the tragic chart, which shows you the number of daily deaths, which also shows a typical or a similar sort of like curve pattern. And we have, in some countries that have already reduced those numbers dramatically. China is the one that is ahead of everyone else, and many countries which are trying to bend its curve. So we have a few facts, but we have lots of unknowns when you look at those facts. For example, the most fundamental one that many of us have been wondering from the beginning is how many people die from the disease. At the end of the day, that's the biggest concerns, or one of the biggest concerns that we all have. What is the death rate if someone catches the infection? Now, we don't know much about it, and we don't know much about it because we don't know how many people have gotten the infection. The amount of tests is limited, and even the quality of those tests is being very much challenged by studies that have been done over time. Now, it could be that we find, and we'll find this only years later, the fatality rates are a lot lower. And maybe our reaction today is a little bit too strong because the fatality rates might be smaller, but it could also be that it's the other way around. The fatality rates are a lot higher than what we think. Now, let me give you a perspective on this, a quick perspective showing you a few more charts. Now, this is a chart that tries to ignore the question of testing. we don't look at how many people have tested positive or negative. We look at fatalities as a percentage of the population. So if you look at the headline, it says confirmed deaths as per million people in a country. Now, these pictures look scary, look worrisome, because you see these lines that are still trending upwards in most countries. And the numbers start looking very large. Now, they're not the same everywhere. They're not the same everywhere because some countries started earlier, so the spread will continue farther in some countries, but also because the conditions might be different, because the spread was stronger, so many more people got infected, or maybe there's some issues with the limits of the healthcare system. So if you do a quick comparison, you have a country like France, which is around 120 fatalities per million people, and you have countries at the bottom like South Korea or Singapore, or even Germany or the US with much smaller numbers. France is not the country with the highest number. The countries with the highest number happen to be Spain and Italy. So if I add them to this graph, I have to change the scale because the number of France was about 120. Spain and Italy are a much higher level, which is 250. Now, these are really large numbers already. And the evidence that we're accumulating in particular over the last days is that these numbers might be underestimating the true number of fatalities. Why is that? Because many people don't get tested. In particular, old people who never make it to a hospital, they don't get qualified as death caused by COVID. So the more we look into the numbers, the more we get a sense that these numbers underestimate the true extent of the spread. I'll give you an anecdote, a tragic anecdote from a city in Italy, Bergamo. If you look at the blue columns that go from 2015 to 2019, those are the typical deaths in this city in a normal month in March in the previous years. Now, the black column that you see at the end tells you how many people died in March this year. Now, as you can see, the number of excess deaths is really, really high, from numbers which are somewhere around maybe 200, 250 to numbers which are closer to 800. Now, that's a factor which is much, much bigger than what the previous chart that I've showed you includes. So what I want to highlight here, and I want to move away from some of these tragic numbers, is that there's a lot of unknowns. We still don't know what this pandemic will look like at the end, and we'll have to go back and understand all these numbers better. But it is clear that this is a tragedy in some countries and something needs to be done. This is not just a regular flu or anything else that we've seen before. Now, there's some optimistic views when you look at that slide that says, well, maybe fatalities are very high because everyone is getting it. So everyone is already getting the disease, and we're gonna go into a world of what we call herd immunity. So many of us have gone through it. We didn't notice, we didn't have the symptoms. So that means that as months pass and we realize that's the case, we can go back to normal. We can bring the economy back to normal much faster. Now, there's a lot of debate about this. What is the extent to which people have gotten infected and how many of these people don't even realize and have never been tested? And there's some evidence which sort of contradicts a little bit each other. There's some evidence that looked at NBA players in the US in the early weeks of the spread in the US. They were tested, many of them were tested without symptoms, and there was a surprising number of them, not very high, but surprising still, that had already the infection. So that led people to believe that the infection was running wild across everyone. Now, there's more data that says exactly the opposite. If you look at Iceland, Iceland is a country that is testing a large number of people in the population, and they still find that the spread of the virus is quite contained. Now, other data are started looking more like Iceland, where the idea that we are acquiring herd immunity as we speak, I think at this point, it doesn't seem to be validated by the data. Maybe there's gonna be different tests in the future that are gonna give us a different message. And that means that we still have to keep very, very close eye on all these numbers because we're not ready to lift the gates and have a further spread going forward. Now, there's a million other questions that I don't have the time to address. Can asymptotic cases be contagious? How contagious? Are recovered patients immune for how long? What is the counterfactual to what we're doing? We see all these lines. What if we stop what we're doing? What would the lines look like? There's lots of unknowns. My summary of all these unknowns is, given what we know today, this is still an emergency, and we're gonna have to be very, very careful about lifting any of the decisions we've made to protect from the spread. Now, what were the decisions we made to protect from the spread? We went into a lockdown mode across many of the countries where you all see it. The possibility of moving, the possibility of visiting others, the possibility of having meetings is greatly reduced. And what we're trying to do is just making sure that we stop contagion. We're just trying to reduce the speed at which the curve is going up, with the idea that if we flatten it, we'll go to a world where fatalities will be reduced and hospitals will be under less pressure. And as we do that, we start counting on the days until we can get out of this mode. But then we're thinking, what is going to happen to the second wave? What if once we leave the gates, we start having a second hump that looks like the first one? So in reality, we can never escape that. So that's my summary of what we know in terms of science. You'll see in a second as I talk about the economics, I'm going to make a very strong connection between this forecast, the forecast of the disease, and the forecast that I myself will make about the economy. Now, we're going to take a small pause here. I'll bring Chris back, and then we'll take some questions, and he'll highlight some of the questions we've had.
Thanks, Antonio. So do you feel like we're moving too fast at the moment to lift lockdowns? Is more coordination needed?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have right now is a discussion on moving the lockdowns, which is very different in different countries. These conversations cannot happen at the same speed in each country because each country's curve looks different, each country's measures look different. I think it's for sure very soon to call victory in the majority of countries. We're gonna have to, if any, reopen in small steps and keep a very close eye on the number of infections, because we might be doing on and off measures in terms of containment. Now, I look at the country where I live, Singapore, and that's what we've gone through in the last months. We started with very small numbers. The numbers were very much under control. Then we've seen recently a peak that has forced the government to put a strong containment measures, even if the numbers are not that high. But what they want to avoid is that the numbers become very high. So I expect to see something very similar everywhere.
And how do you see the role of leadership right now with among politicians particularly? I mean, are they reacting fast enough? Are they coordinating enough?
I mean, I think that's an issue that I find is a little bit troublesome because we've seen from the beginning, we've seen a lot of statements at the national level. We have not seen great statements at the international level, even in regions like Europe, where there's clearly supranational institutions like the European Union that should take that role. We have seen each country scrambling to get the same medical supplies, to get the same number of ventilators, and even fighting with each other to see who can get them faster. Now, things have improved a little bit, but I think we still have a situation. This is a global pandemic. This is not a national pandemic, where coordination across the world will make whatever steps are necessary faster and more efficient.
And there's one question here from the audience. Do you think in a couple of years we will look back and judge that a cure of corona was worse than the disease itself?
Again, I don't think so. I think, again, it's a guess at this point. I think there was no alternative to what we've done. I think we face lots of alternatives going forward, and I'll talk about them in a second. But I think given how much out of control those curves were, in particular in some countries, and how the countries that were following were exactly following the same path, I think that was the situation that had to be stopped. Now, once we stop it, once we control it, I think we face some choices. But I doubt we're gonna say that we overreacted when we decided to do some of these measures.
Great. Thank you, Antonio. I'll let you get on with the next segment. We've got a lot of questions coming in, which I think relate to the next part, and perhaps we can follow up with some of those questions after the next segment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. Now, let me talk about the economic side of it. So we start where we left it. We have a situation that from a health point of view, we have decided to put the economy in a situation, or the society in a situation of a lockdown. Now, what is the outcome of that? Now, the outcome of that is obvious. If none of us can go to work, economic activity stops. It doesn't stop for everyone. It doesn't stop to 100%, but it stops in a way which is dramatic. Now, what do we see when we look at the data? This is not a normal shock. This is the fastest GDP fall ever. The way GDP is falling is just dramatic. Now, be careful how you read the numbers. Some people sometimes report quarterly numbers annualized. So then they say the US economy is sort of like going down at a rate of minus 30%. That's not a very useful number. The true quarter-to-quarter number is about minus 8%, which is a massive number. But still, in terms of speed, this is the fastest GDP fall ever. Now, let me show you some pictures that some of you might have seen before. It all started in China. This is manufacturing conditions in China in the month of February. So obviously, if you look at the right-hand side of this picture, you see this massive line falling very, very fast to levels that we had not seen before in 2008. So very fast speed and to a depth, which is really, really concerning. If I look at the US, if we look at unemployment claims by week, the last 2 weeks, we've seen a number of unemployment claims that is off the charts. I mean, those are numbers, if you go back in time, if you look at 2008 or any of the previous recessions, we've never seen anything like this. If you look at Europe, if you look at, this is one of those indicators, which is a leading indicator of GDP, which is the PMI indicator. So it's the green line. If you look at the composite indicator, which is both manufacturing and services, is dropping in March faster than it ever dropped in 2008. So we're seeing a drop in the economy, regardless of which country you look at, which is as fast as we've ever seen before. Now, let me now bring an argument which says this is true. At the same time, this is not a normal recession. We closed the economy. I told you not to go to work. We understand why GDP is so low. In fact, if I want to look for a parallel, which I know is not a perfect parallel, but I do want you to think like this for a second, we do this every summer. We do this every winter vacation. We stop working and GDP goes down. Let me give you an example from the country where I come from Spain. This is industrial production in Spain over the last months of 2019. Now, what I want you to see is that V shape that you see, that happens in the month of August. Production drops by 30%. We know why. This is not a recession. And when people go back to work, production goes back to normal. Now, there's an optimistic reading of that slide that says, look, we're seeing a massive fall in GDP, but it's not happening because a business ran out of ideas. It's not happening because the banks are going down. It's happening because we shut down the economy. Could it be that as we reopen the economy, we go back to normal? Could it be that we have a V shape like the one we see every August in Spain and many other countries? Now, there's some evidence of that if you look at China. So there's a couple of pictures here. On the left-hand side, you have the same PMI index that I gave you earlier for China. Now it includes the month of March. Now you can see this V-shape phenomenon in China as China is going back to normal. Now, I'm not claiming that China is going back to the same level, but at least you find a rebound, which is really, really clear in the data. On the right-hand side, you have some pictures that gives you a highlight of contamination and increases in dioxide concentration. And you can see how from February to March that you see a lot more lights, which means more concentration of that pollution. And that means that China is slowly going back to normal. Now we see the same thing if you look at traffic in some of the big cities in China. This is from TomTom. Don't look at the weekend where there's less traffic, but if you look at any of the other days, the red line is the current traffic and the blue line is on normal days before 2020. You can see the lines almost looking the same, suggesting that there has been a little bit of a V-shaped rebound in a country, which is a little bit ahead of everyone else. Now, let me give you a perspective. I'll talk later more about Europe and the US, but let me give you a perspective also from the rest of the world. What are emerging markets seeing? Now, they're seeing the same as everyone else. They're seeing the same as China, the same as Europe, the same as the US, but things are a little bit more troublesome. Why? Because we see these massive capital outflows. So in addition to the disease, in addition to the lockdown, we're also seeing these big capital outflows. I'll just give you a quick picture that summarizes that. These are the capital flows to emerging markets, starting at the beginning of any year, going all the way to the end of the year. If you look at the red line, that's the current year. You can see a massive fall in capital flows that we've never seen before. Even in 2008, where we had a similar global crisis, you see the blue line going down, but nothing similar to that. Now, when you have a capital outflow, you have shortage of dollars. You have countries having difficulty financing the current account deficits, which many of them have. You have, in addition, because of the crisis, a falling commodity prices, less revenues, less exports, and you end up with a situation which is worse. Now, is it worse everywhere? Is every emerging market in the same situation? No, there's a lot of heterogeneity. You have countries, in particular in Asia, that have current account surpluses, that have healthy balance sheets. They can use the foreign reserves they've accumulated in the past, and that means they will have some time at least to sustain the current environment. So in emerging markets, my main message is you're gonna have a lot more noise, you're gonna have probably bigger crises, sovereign defaults, but it's gonna be very much heterogeneous, with some countries and regions surviving while other countries will go into crisis that will be long lasting. Now, let me switch quickly to the economic policies that we're implementing. Now, let me start with the principles, and then let me give you the details. The principles are, this is a large shock. This is a large event that could get even worse over time. So the first thing that I want policymakers to be is to be blunt, to be aggressive. Second, this is not your regular shock. We're shutting down the economy. We want the economy to be ready to go back as fast as possible when we reopen it. So you want to do whatever you can to keep the economy alive while it's in coma. You want to, for example, protect workers' contracts. In an ideal world, I'm gonna keep the association between the worker and the company. The government will pay the salary. That's better than having the worker being unemployed, losing the contact with the company, because once we go back to normal, as long as the worker still works for the company, the rebound is likely to be faster than if you have to rehire the whole labor force. Same for companies. You want companies to stay alive. You don't want them to go bankrupt. So we're talking about protecting their cash flow. We're talking about credit, anything that keeps the economy alive until we can go back to business will be the right policy at this point. So this is an aspect which is very different from previous crises. We did not have this question in previous crises or this issue. We're talking about a crisis in the banking system, in the financial system, in the internet sector in the 1990s. This is a very peculiar crisis, and that's why policies are slightly different than in other crises. Now, let me give you some details now. What are central banks doing? They're being blunt. They're being very aggressive. We're bringing back quantitative easing with different names, and we're talking about magnitudes that the first step are going to be large. We're talking about numbers on the 750 billion US dollar, euros, if you talk about the US and the euro area. These are not the final numbers. This is the first step, likely to get bigger. There's an incredible amount of intervention in markets to keep them liquid so that markets don't freeze, that asset prices don't collapse and make companies and financial institutions go bankrupt. And there's a lot of intervention at the international level because there's a shortage of US dollars. So central banks have agreed to introduce these swaps between central banks. So central banks around the world can access dollars from the US Federal Reserve, and that keeps, in this case, international financial markets alive. But in addition, you need to be smart. You need to try to channel these funds, these actions towards where they must go. You need to try to channel this financing, not to the banks only, but also to the companies. And when we say the companies, in this case, many of them are small and medium-sized companies. Now, they're being very creative, but this is something which we're struggling with. How do you get this credit going all the way to where it's needed? And then in some areas, in particular in the euro area, you need to deal with the fact that it's a European central bank, but then you have a number of countries that look very different. So you cannot just have the same instrument, the same policy for everyone. I'll talk about it when I talk about some of the details of Europe. And then on the regulatory side, it's not quite monetary policy, but in many cases associated to central banks, we're going to be very, very careful and take a pause. We're going to tell banks, you don't have to deal with non-performing loans over the next number of weeks. We're going to relax some of the regulatory rules that we put in place that were in some cases very constraining to make sure that you don't run into those constraints. Now, some examples of this, I'm just going to pick up some headlines. The European Central Bank has announced this pandemic emergency purchase program, which is the equivalent of quantitative easing, with very, very flexible rules. So this is sort of like quantitative easing plus. The added a layer of targeted refinancing operations for banks, which is again trying to make as much liquidity as available for the financial system. And then they're trying to reach companies by going into purchases of assets that they have not done in the past, like buying commercial paper, which is something that in the past they haven't done, or they have done to a very small extent. The Federal Reserve is doing the same thing. They've established a temporary facility to allow not just domestic investors, but also foreign, in particular foreign central banks, to take their US bonds and turn them into cash, into liquidity. Again, that's just to make sure that international financial markets work. There's also changes in regulation. The supplementary leverage ratio for banks has been suspended for a while, or at least has been changed. And then there's facilities to try to lend to small businesses. This is what I mentioned before. You need to make sure that the lending reaches the place that is needed. And the place that is needed is not just the banks, it's also the small and medium enterprises. So when it comes to monetary policy, we've had large actions, and actions which in my mind are trying to be as creative as possible. I don't think we've yet reached the end of these actions, but I think we've seen a lot of progress. Now, what about governments, fiscal policy? Same logic. First thing, you need to be blunt. You need to have large fiscal deficits. Now, large fiscal deficits mean, these are examples from a few countries, you need to increase spending, you need to cut taxes in numbers which look like this. You see some big numbers, 4.4 in Germany, 5.5 in the US. You see smaller numbers in other countries, but let's be honest, these numbers are changing as we speak. So this is not the final number. This is just standard fiscal policy. We're doing more things on the right-hand side of this slide. We're also guaranteeing some of the loans that companies are taking. So if a company goes to a bank and needs a loan, the government will guarantee that loan. If you look at a country like Germany, the magnitude of that is incredibly high. We're talking about 32% of GDP in terms of the capacity to guarantee loans. Again, we're trying to make sure that liquidity reaches the right institutions, the right companies. It's not just purely injecting liquidity, it's making sure that it goes to the right place. Now, there's a lot more. There's a lot about being smart as well. Some of these spending should go to where it belongs. It should go to healthcare. We need to prepare ourselves for what is going on, but also for the next wave, We're trying to build these partial unemployment schemes to keep people attached to the company. This is very easy in countries that already had them, in Germany, in France, and in many European countries, in Denmark. It is harder in countries that do not have these schemes ready. So in the US, it's a little bit harder to do this than in some of the European countries. We're doing, as I said earlier, lots of guarantees to companies so that they stay alive. Now, there's some things that we have done in previous crises that we shouldn't be doing that much today. Just cutting taxes for everyone doesn't help. It puts money into everyone's pocket, but we're not ready to spend it. So you need to make sure that the resources go to the right place, that they keep the economies alive, as opposed to just putting money into everyone's pocket. That's not going to help that much. Whenever the economy is ready to go up, then it will be ready to what I call hit the accelerator, make sure that demand is very, very strong. Now, there's a big question that I'm sure many of you are asking. Who pays for this? These are large amounts. Debt is going to go up. What do we do with this large debt? Let me give you an optimistic view on this. I'm going to give you one example. I know that I'm not covering every country in the world. The situation is not the same everywhere, but I want to give you an optimistic view that debt is not an issue. Government debt is the least of our concerns today. Let me give you a numerical example. Imagine a country that issues so much debt that it amounts to 30% of the GDP. That's a big number. Issue debt in 1 year, which is 30% of GDP, is a massive number. Now imagine that you issue this debt with a 30-year maturity. So you go long-term to make sure that you don't have any pressure next year. Now, what is the interest rate burden every year that you need to pay to keep this debt alive? Now, the answer, I'm going to tell you how I got these numbers, is 0.02% of GDP. That's not a big number. These are the interest payments that you do every year. Now, in 30 years, you're going to have to deal with it if you want, or you're going to roll over that debt. But the good thing is, because GDP is going to grow in the next 30 years, the debt to GDP ratio of that new issue debt is not going to be 30, it's going to be down to 15%. Now, how did I come up with these numbers? I made some assumptions. I assume that the economy is going to grow over the next 30 years in nominal terms, that includes inflation, at a rate of 2.5. Now, that's a very low number. Most central banks, including the European Central Bank, the US Central Bank, the Bank of England, and many others around the world, are already shooting for 2% inflation. So I'm not putting a lot of inflation here, and I'm putting very little growth. I'm being really pessimistic about growth. Now, where do I get the interest rate from? From anywhere. You just can check. Germany today can borrow at a rate of 0.089%. So if you use those two numbers, you can get the magnitudes I'm giving you here. Now, some of you might say, wait, but not every country has the same interest rate. Correct. So countries that have higher interest rate will have a bigger burden. And we have to do the math and see whether this is a big burden or not. That's going to depend a lot by country. Now, when you look at Europe, it's a very interesting situation. I'm putting here a recent article that I wrote together with other European economists, because we have European institutions. In particular, we have something which is called the European Stability Mechanism that could potentially provide funding for all countries in Europe at interest rates which are as low as the number I gave you before. The problem is we need the political will to do that. The political will to say these are exceptional circumstances. We need to make sure that those low numbers apply to all countries, not just to one. Of course, that's not an easy question to deal with. We've struggled with this in the past in Europe, but a few of us and many others are arguing that these are exceptional times. We need to get it right this time. We need to ensure that there's no pressure on these governments, not next year, for the next 3 decades. Now, when it comes to other countries, not Europe, obviously there's nothing like the European Union to sort of try to get everyone nice low interest rates. There's the World Bank, there's the IMF that is going to step in. Now, here again, I'm putting 2 headlines from both of these institutions. They're taking actions already. Now, unfortunately, the number of emerging markets that will knock at the door of these 2 institutions is going to be large. So we might struggle with the issue. Do they have enough power to deal with everyone? The IMF just revealed that 90 countries have already asked the question, can we have some funding provided through a program? That's a number that we've never seen before. Good intentions, good policies, but the world is going to face the question, maybe we need to find more budget, a bigger budget to the IMF and the World Bank to deal with emerging markets. So that's my diagnosis of where we are today. Monetary policy, doing the right things, being smart and being creative. Fiscal policy, being very blunt and doing their best as well to be creative. I do not worry about government debt at this point. And in particular, I don't worry if a country can ensure that interest rates remain low and can issue debt, which is long-term debt, which is not going to put any pressure in the short term. Now, I'm going to talk more about the economics as I look forward and I look at how we get out of here. But let me take a second pause here, take a few questions from Chris that he's been reading all your questions in the Q&A.
Thanks, Antonio. Yeah, the questions are definitely pouring in, and I'd like to group a few of them together here. There's a lot coming in around what this means for the future of globalization and integration specifically. I mean, as you look at Europe, for example, there's now talks and debate about corona bonds and things like that. What do you think this means for the shape of, say, European integration, but also, globalization in general after this?
I mean, I'm trying to be optimistic here. I'm hoping that in the context of Europe, we'll see a step in the right direction, which is a step to understand that we're all together in this. We see steps towards more solidarity because this is a unique event. Hopefully we won't see ever again in our lifetime. And that would be, I think, a great boost to the notion that coordination within the European Union is useful. Because I think other countries will be missing that. Other countries might not have the same ability to coordinate with their neighbors or with people that they might benefit from. Now, at the world level, I think as we get out of where we are, there's a big question, which is, are we going to have to rewrite the rules of globalization? Are we going to have to stop all the travel we do? Are we going to have to stop all the dispersion of production facilities across the world? I think we're going to ask that question. I don't know what the answer will be. I think if the crisis ends up being shorter than what we think today, which crossing our fingers, I think it might be that we go back almost to normal. Now, if the crisis is spread over the fall and we spend months in a situation similar to today, I think we'll have a situation where it might be that we have to question some of the steps that we've taken towards hyper-globalization.
And there's a lot of questions also on the speed of recovery and what you'd expect to see here in terms of, you talked earlier about the shape of China and how they've already started to come back to work. What is your take on how long it would take us to actually recover from this?
I mean, I think what China has done is, I think, incredible, because we've seen that China has managed to recover from the crisis very, very fast. Of course, they're not done, so I would not say that they're done and that they're back to normal, but that V shape is very promising because it means that we have a number of countries that could potentially do the same thing once they get to the same level. So I think that's the best that we can imagine. That would be a V-shaped scenario, but if we go beyond China and we look at other countries, that seems to be a very optimistic scenario for many of them, because there we have a situation where we don't see the end yet. We do not have any evidence of a V-shaped scenario. And my prediction, which might sound a little bit like a tautology, is the longer we stay in the current environment, the more this is gonna look like a wide U. In other words, if we spend a few months in the current economic environment, there's no way to keep the economy alive anymore. You have to restart it from zero. And that means a very, very long recession and potentially a very deep recession.
What's your take on when economies reopen and the strategies they're going to take, the measures they're going to unfold? So we, in a social distancing world, potentially for a long time, as we try to keep that curve flattened, how's that going to play out with different sectors?
So let me highlight some of these things in the next slides. I wanted to show a couple more slides on that, and then we'll go back to whatever other questions we have. So let me just highlight very quickly from a perspective of going back to normal, what needs to happen. Now, let me start with the health perspective, because we need to find a way to stop the spread. We need to bring this R number that the scientists talk about below 1, that we clearly see that the spread is going down. Now, some countries have done it. I have a picture here from Hong Kong, which started in February all the way to almost today. You see this R number, which is how many people you infect when you are infected, going below 1. Now, we need it clearly below 1 to feel comfortable. But again, that's the progress that every country is doing, and every country will have to check this. We need to make sure that we're testing, making sure that we understand where we are at any point in time. We need to make sure that we understand who's gone through it. And if you've gone through this, you can go back to work as fast as you want. And we need to keep testing those who haven't to make sure that we don't spread more. I think we're gonna have to keep a lot of the practices we started in many countries for a while, longer than what we would like, from mass to distance to no large gatherings. And then we need hopefully lots of coordination in terms of drug treatment, vaccine, and building capacity production in the healthcare sector to deal with whatever other wave we get. Now, this is the health part. You were asking about the economic side. Now, from the economic side, this is a little bit difficult, partly because we have not done this before. We have not shut down a whole economy and then restarted slowly, but we have a few hints on what to do. Now, some of us could continue working from home, because many of us could still work from home. There's some interesting studies that are coming out that up to 30% of the workers could potentially work from home with minimal disruption. Again, that will help us a lot if we continue this for a few more weeks, in some cases months. And then you open sectors slowly, because you need to make sure that you feel under control. Now you're gonna open those sectors which are economically more important faster. Obviously, food has never shut down in any country because we need the food supply to continue. But there's lots of other sectors which are connected to others, which if you don't open them, you cannot open the others. So you have to have a good understanding of the supply chain, what economists call the input-output table, to understand which sectors open first. And you need to open sectors as well that are less likely to lead to spread. For example, if you open big commercial malls where everyone is close to each other shopping, that doesn't sound like a good idea to start with. And then we need to have a mentality which is okay to see infections. We need to have a mentality that brings back a sense of control. And as long as we feel in control, we can keep the strategy of opening the economy slowly. We might have to take a step back occasionally. We might have to raise some of these barriers to make sure that we feel under control. Now, what I'm saying is not easy. It requires changes in the way we work. It requires changes in the way we interact with each other. And it requires a lot of clarity in terms of what is the strategy of the government, to what extent is working, why are we doing what we're doing, and why is it that we're changing our minds because the data looks different. So it is possible to do this, but it is challenging. And I hope in particular governments understand that and start thinking about this as soon as we can. Now, I'm going to put in front of you two scenarios. They're both a little bit extreme, one very optimistic, one very pessimistic. The optimistic one follows the conversation we had earlier. Look at China. You've seen China, you see South Korea, even Japan, sort of still staying, running their businesses, even if they're fighting or they fought in the past with the spread. That's an optimistic scenario for the rest of the world, for Europe, for the US and everyone else. But we need to be realistic that if we're not careful, if we think we're there and we lift all the barriers immediately, we're going to end up in the second scenario, which is also what I referred to before. The crisis will persist because we'll have waves of spread that continue and send people back home and send business back to the same situation as today. And then we face a crisis that will persist for months. Now, we can have the fiscal policies I pointed out before for a few months, but we cannot keep them for a year. We will see companies failing, we will see financial institutions failing, and we'll go to a situation that will look like the economics of a war. Now, I'm really hoping that we don't go there, that we really planning the exit, in particular in countries that have not done it yet, to make it as much as possible to look like the first scenario. I think it's possible, I think it's feasible, but it does require a strategy, which is very good, and is properly executed. I'll stop here and I'll take whatever remaining questions there are, Chris.
Thanks, Antonio. There's a lot coming in around emerging markets. So we've talked quite a lot about Europe and the global situation and integration in general. How do you see this playing out in emerging markets where, for example, there's a lot of people in manufacturing sectors, migrant labor, for example? It's been very difficult, for example, India to get the lid on this. How do you see the things shaping up differently in markets like that?
I mean, I think you have two dimensions which are very different. One is many of these markets cannot afford the containment policies you see in the advanced economies. You cannot tell people to stay home because the consequences of that will be much worse. People need their income to survive. And the government does not have the ability to implement the measures we see in Europe, where the government can keep alive people, incomes, etc., etc. So I think their health policies are going to look different, less dramatic. Now, we're all crossing fingers that partly the weather in some of those countries help contain the spread. This is an unknown to what extent that will happen, but there's some evidence, small evidence. And we're also hoping that is enough to contain the spread enough so that they don't go through a wave which causes a number of fatalities, which is a lot higher than what we're seeing in advanced economies. So that's one of the elements that are struggling with. The second one is the economic one, which is, again, they do not have the capability of running the policies that the US or Europe are running, or the advanced economies in Asia. They're struggling with these capital outflows. And from an economic point of view, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are going to be against the wall. They're going to lack the funding to keep their economy alive. They're going to knock at the door of the IMF. And I hope the IMF has enough capital to deal with all these crises. If they don't, I think we're going to see a series of sovereign defaults and other debt crises in some of these emerging markets.
And do you see potential? There's been a lot of talk around this idea that we might have to have repeated lockdowns as waves keep coming, and what would be the economic consequences of that, especially for emerging markets?
I mean, I think what we see today with the technology that we have today, I think that's very likely that we're going to have to go through some waves and some tightening of restrictions, loosening of restrictions as we go along. Now, my hope is that we have massive improvements in testing over the coming weeks. It has to be over the coming weeks so that we can have a lot more clarity on how far the spread has gone, who's infected, who's not, so that we can micromanage this, as opposed to what we're doing now. We're not micromanaging it. We're stopping any movement to make sure that the spread doesn't go anywhere. I think ideally you want to know where the spread is and stop it where it is, as opposed to affecting everyone. Now, again, you see a country like China, which is really, really following that strategy, the strategy of micromanaging, using sometimes tools which other countries don't feel very comfortable with, using technology, using tools that in some cases go beyond so like what some people will feel comfortable in terms of lack of privacy. But that's an example of what sort of needs to be done to make sure that we don't need to go into these massive containment policies, but we need to fight it more at the local level. If we get the testing right, I think we can manage it much better than if we're just shooting in the dark, trying to stop something that we cannot see.
And one question keeps popping up is, what sort of recovery are we looking at here? V, W, U, or L?
The answer to that question depends on the day, the news that I read when I wake up in the morning. I'm still counting on that progress on testing. I'm still counting on governments to understand now what this pandemic looks like and be ready for the future waves, so that if there are those future waves, we're going to manage them in a way which does not resemble what we've done in the past. But I'm also very clear that this is a challenge. This is not easy. We need governments to be really good at what they're doing, communicating very well, that people accept the instructions that they're giving. And probably most of you have seen, this is not an easy task. It's not an easy task for governments to say, stay home. They have to put systems in place, which in some cases are draconian, that we've never thought that would be possible in some of these countries. So I think there's a window to get out with something that looks like a V shape. It could be a deep V, it could be a recession still, in some cases a deep recession, but it will have a shape of a V. But again, there's lots of challenges to governments, to testing technology, and to avoiding the future waves.
And as you mentioned earlier, the governments are really stepping in here, IMF as well. What does this perhaps augur a sense of austerity to come, or perhaps even more than what we saw after the global financial crisis?
I mean, I think we learned a lesson with the global financial crisis. Maybe not everyone, but I think we learned a lesson that austerity was a bad idea in that case. I think in this case, not only we learned that lesson, but I think there's so like the reason for the crisis is so external that it's very hard to point fingers. It's not that I'm going to point finger to a government or to a country and say, you misbehave. The debt that you have is your responsibility, deal with it. Here we have an environment that no one is responsible for this. This is a natural disaster. It is very difficult for anyone at this stage to point fingers and say you need to react, control your debt. That's better than what you're doing in terms of taking care of the health crisis. I don't think we'll see that. Again, maybe 5 years from now, we'll talk about austerity again. I don't think we'll see it as fast as we saw it in the global financial crisis.
Well, thank you so much, Antonio. We had a lot of questions we didn't get to, but we did manage to get through some very important ones there. What we're going to do is come to a close now. Thank you everyone for your participation and all your engaging questions. There will be an opportunity to get some of these answered. I've been told we're going to post them on the INSEAD Lifelong Learning page on LinkedIn so they can be discussed and debated. You can also find out more about lifelong learning at INSEAD at these websites and also at our what INSEAD is doing in response to COVID-19, all of our expert contributions on that at insead.edu/COVID-19. We've also got the next webinar coming up next Tuesday, 14th. This will be with Panish Puranam on designing remote collaboration. So he's an expert in organization design. You'll also all get a survey on Qualtrics just after this. But once again, let me thank Antonio and all of you for all your great questions and for your time today.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Stay safe.